Okay, well, now I will turn it right over to Ken Egan to introduce our speaker today.
Great, thank you. I'm proud to introduce Matt Lautzenheiser. Matt is a native of Northeastern Ohio, and after completing his bachelor and master's degrees in history, he became executive director of a museum in Ohio. In 2014, Missoula caught a break, and Matt decided to move west and become executive director of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, building on the great legacy of Bob Brown. As someone who spends a lot of time around museums, I have to especially credit Matt with his sensitivity to audience needs and response. He's put up great new signage. His exhibits are multimedia and engaging and fascinating. And as you'll discover, he has great plans for building out the museum. I'm very excited to hear about. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Matt is also the president of the Museums Association of Montana. And so he's representing all museums in the state at a national level. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Can everybody hear me okay? Just kind of shake your heads. Perfect. So I do have to say this is my second one of these Zoom presentations to a group, but I really appreciate you thinking of me, and I appreciate Ken thinking of me and inviting me out to do this and connecting with Jim as well too. So I guess I'd start out with a little bit of the background on myself. Ken mentioned I did grow up in Northeast Ohio. I was born in a small town about 90 miles south of Cleveland. From there, I did my undergraduate, my master's in Ohio, and then started working in a museum called Hale Farm and Village. And Hale Farm was a living history site. So it involved the people in full costumes and the historic buildings, and it was set up to look like a mid-19th century village. So I did that. Actually, I did the research and portrayed a mid-19th century doctor for about 2 years as a graduate student, which was an incredible amount of fun. I still say to this day, if I had my choice, that was probably the most fun job I've ever worked in a museum. They paid me to sit around and talk about history all day and sit in an old house, which was pretty great. So I was there for a while. After graduate school, I became the site historian at that site, which meant I got to do all the research, write programming, do interpretation, all those kind of things, which was, again, a ton of fun. But I did take my first job as an executive director at a small house museum in the town I grew up in called the J.E. Reeves Victorian Home and Museum. I was all of 28 when I took that job, which was pretty incredible. I do have to say there were a lot of years that I would walk into a room and be the youngest person by about 30 years. But at the same time, it was incredibly rewarding. And I followed, much like with following Bob Brown here, I followed a history of a museum that had been in existence for almost 30 years and it had 2 directors. Both of them stayed over a decade in that position. So it was a lot to follow, but at the same time, it was incredibly exciting because it was such a small museum, I was able to come in with a lot of different fresh ideas. And because it was so small, if I had an idea, it meant that I started from writing the programming to producing the programming to selling the tickets for it to cleaning up the chairs after it was done. So it was great. It was a wonderful way to really kind of develop my vision of museums and the way they can reach crowds and reach audiences and kind of share their community's history. And it was an incredible amount of fun. But I think we all get to that point where I was working for a small nonprofit, not making much money, had no benefits, no retirement. And you get to that point where you think, okay, I've got 2 kids and a spouse, and it's been great that I've been able to do this, but it's time to find something a little more stability. So in the end of 2013, I started looking around, and there's actually a fun story about how I ended up here in Missoula. So I saw the job for the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula advertised, and my brother-in-law had lived in Montana for probably close to 20 years at that point. He came to UM in the mid-1990s, and he has his own logging business now out in Potomac. So we'd visited a couple times. So I knew Missoula was a great town. But the job came open, and I just remember it because I remember jokingly saying to my wife, because at the time I was looking at bigger cities and other markets, and I said, oh, you know, there's this job in Missoula. And I kind of jokingly said it to her at first. And so we talked. I think that night as we were laying in bed, getting ready to fall asleep, and she leans over to me and she says, did you apply for that job in Missoula? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm really qualified for it. I mean, it's an accredited museum. It's a big step up from where I'm at now. And she looked at me real seriously and she said, I already told my brother you're applying for it. So in all essence, I was essentially guilted into applying for the job, which is, you know, like a lot of our decisions in life, it's been one of the best decisions I've made to move my family here and to take over at this museum. So long story short, I went through the interview process, which is pretty intense when Dr. Brown retired. And in late June of 2014, I moved my family here to Missoula, and we haven't looked back. I've got 2 teenage boys now. They're hard to believe. They're soon to be 15 and 17, both at Big Sky High School. And it's been an incredible place to raise 2 children. To be in such a caring community that looks out for its people and that values arts and culture has been a wonderful environment to raise those boys in. So that gives you a little bit of a background on me. So I guess I'll kind of move on to the museum itself. So if I could, and this is going to be odd to do it on Zoom, but if I could have you raise your hands if you've been to the historical museum at Fort Missoula. Okay, nearly everyone. Great. So you know that our museum, we kind of get confused at times. There's a lot of assumption that because the word Fort Missoula is in our title, that we're a military museum. And that probably couldn't be further from the truth. What we really are is essentially a county historical society. Our mission statement is to preserve Missoula County's history for the education and enjoyment of the public. So we're not specifically related to Fort Missoula. We actually are very fortunate that our neighbors next door are the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History. So they are specifically geared towards studying military history and interpreting that. So we are kind of left for the other stories. So we kind of have a 4-part interpretation. And we do interpret, obviously, the history of Missoula County. We interpret the history of Fort Missoula, also the lumber industry or the timber industry in Western Montana. And then kind of our final areas that we really put an emphasis on in recent years is the internment camp that was here at Fort Missoula during the 1940s that held about 1,200 Italians and 1,000 Japanese men that were foreign nationals. And I'll get into that a little bit later because we've got a pretty major project, or actually 2 of them we're working on with that. So we tell those stories. The site itself is 32 acres. We now have about 20 different historic structures. We see about 4,000 school kids a year, and general visitation, which includes folks that use the property, as well as those that pay admission to come in. We were at 50,000 for 2 years in a row. We dropped back to 46 this past year, mainly due to that last 4 months of the year where we weren't open and things were tough. So we feel like we have a pretty big footprint here in the community. We do a lot of collaboration with other organizations, whether it be places like our neighbor, the Military Museum, the Art Museum. We actually have a really fun program that's coming up next week. The Montana Repertory Theater is doing an original play that they're actually performing on our lookout tower, which is kind of neat. It's called The Fog, and it's about, and I'm probably going to pronounce the name wrong, and if we have any Forest Service people on here, I apologize. Gifford Pinchot? Did I say it right? Okay. It's a reimagining of Gifford Pinchot and his marriage to a ghost. So we didn't write the play, but it should be kind of fun. But I think it illustrates this fact that at the Historical Museum, we see ourselves as a community agency or community organization. In any way that we can help other nonprofits or partner with them for something that advances both of our mission, or that it's something within our capacity that can help them to grow, we do. Another great example of this, we recently did the Open Air Artist Program, which is, if anybody's heard of it, it is an artist in residency program that takes place and they bring artists in, or they have local artists and they put them in different spaces with the idea that those physical spaces will influence or impact their artwork. We had an amazing artist from New York City last year that did some incredible, she was a native of Japan, and she did some work on the internment camp here and produced a documentary film and all sorts of original artwork. We had a couple local artists last year. This year we had a couple local artists. Some of you probably know Courtney Blazon. Courtney was one of our folks here this year, and she did some great stuff. So it's been really fun, but it's one of those, we don't do it. There's no financial impact for us to do it. We have this space, and we feel strongly that it's great to be able to engage these other groups and help them with that kind of stuff. And this kind of leads me to the other piece of our museum, I think, that has been incredibly important in our stability and our growth, and our ability to do these type of things in our community. And that's the fact that our museum is publicly funded. Back in 2003, Dr. Bob Brown went to the voters of Missoula County and asked for a $2 million levy in support of the historical museum at Fort Missoula. The voters entrusted us with that $2 million, which is in perpetuity, which gives us a financial stability that allows us to see those 4,000 school kids a year and not charge a penny for admission for those school kids to come through. The majority of our big events are free. There are a couple exceptions, but even those, for example, the 4th of July admission rates, the highest admission rate is $5, and for $10 you can get a whole carload of people in. So we try, even on the big events that are fundraisers for our friends group, we still try to keep pricing low, so that it is something where somebody's financial stability or economic ability is never going to impact their ability to visit the museum. That was something else. One of the first things that I looked at when I started, and it would have been about 2015, we decided to make the historical museum free for all Missoula County residents. So, which was another important thing for us. And the way I looked at it was, as voters, you're paying for us in your taxes. So why should we double charge local people who want to come out and visit the museum? And we wanted to encourage local visitation too, because I believe, and the staff believes, that if a community knows its history and has a strong cultural or heritage community, that produces better citizens. I mean, the more we know our own past, we take pride in that past, and it's something that connects us all, whether we're of different political parties or different views. That history is something we all share in common that connects us as a community. So the levy has been huge for us, which kind of leads me into my next topic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Just to kind of give you some perspective on how this has impacted us. Because we do have those public dollars, we are able to pretty much operate in the same manner that we have. Obviously, a lot of things are much like our meeting today. They're virtual now as opposed to being in person, but we have not had to struggle with layoffs or furloughs or anything along those lines with our staff. They're still here, able to interact with the public and continue with the same kind of programming and virtual programming. We've continued to create and install new exhibits that'll be up for a little longer, I think, than we typically would have them up, but that's because currently the main building is closed. So I guess one of the ways this has impacted us is at the Historical Museum, we have essentially two branches. We have a trustee branch or a trustee board, which it controls those public dollars, and those 6 trustees are appointed by the county commissioners here. The museum is run as a department under Missoula County. We also have a friends board, and I think where we're seeing the impact of COVID-19 isn't necessarily with our general operations, which are those tax funded, but it's more with special projects and with our fundraising wing. So the Friends of the Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit. All the funds that they raise go directly towards either special projects at the museum or education type programs. And you guys probably all know the Friends events, but they're things like Forestry Day that we do in April, the 4th of July celebration that we do over the summer, which is become a huge tradition here in the community. Also things like Harvest Festival, which is usually mid-September, and then the cheese curds at the fair. I'm sure, you know, you might not want to admit it, but you've all probably had fried cheese curds at the fair. That was the Friends of the Museum at the time that does that. And that's a huge fundraiser for us. And then probably our most successful fundraiser has been the used book sale that we do in Heritage Hall every year. That's been an amazingly successful and growing event. We've gone from, gosh, we made under 10,000 for the first few years. And that number in the last 6 years, since 2014, I think we jumped at maybe 15 in 2014. And then we've been progressively getting higher from there to the point where the last 2 years that used book sales generated over $20,000 for the Friends of the Historical Museum. And unlike some of our other events, like the cheese curd booth also generates similarly, but there's also $12,000 worth of product we have to purchase in order to sell it. Whereas our book sale, the total expenses for that event are maybe $2,000 to $3,000. So we're able to clear $17,000, $18,000 that goes right into education programs and preservation programs at the museum. So it's been so I guess this gets me back to COVID-19. And you will forgive me, I tend to go off on tangents sometimes, but where COVID-19 has impacted us is we've not been able to do any of those events this year. The fair, you know, the Midway was canceled. We've just recently, we looked at some options for the book sale. We really wanted to have that in the fall. We even looked at options of moving it up to September and trying to do an outdoor sale. And there may have been a way to make it work, but what became really challenging was that we surveyed all of our volunteers that help with the event. And I mean, we're talking 75 or 80 volunteers to make that event happen. And when we did that survey, less than half of them were comfortable with that type of a customer service gathering in public. So it wasn't that we didn't want to do it, but we just simply didn't have the volunteer support that we would need to typically do something like that. So we have pushed those back. We're certainly hopeful, as I'm sure all of you are, that after the first of the year, we'll have a vaccine and things can start to move forward, and hopeful that by next summer we can get back to a more normal version of life where we have things like the 4th of July and we have concerts at Kettle House Amphitheater and all those wonderful things again. So that's kind of a little summary of the staff and the board. As far as the main museum building and kind of any other impacts from COVID, we were really hopeful in June. When we reached the beginning of June, I think we'd gone almost a month without an active case in Missoula. Unfortunately, so with that in mind, we worked with Missoula County, we worked with the health department, and we did open the main museum building in June. We installed plexiglass shields and hand sanitizer and had masks for visitors, and all of our staff wore them. And we lasted about 5 weeks, unfortunately. As the cases started to climb, as June turned to July, one of the challenges we have is that the main museum building where our galleries is a 1911 quartermaster storehouse, meaning it's a brick building with poor circulation that has very tight galleries. And, you know, the combination of not being comfortable putting our volunteers in a situation where they're interacting with a lot of visitors from out of town and 30 people a day coming through, and the challenges with having those tight galleries and trying to figure out circulation of people and all those things, we just didn't feel safe at that point leaving the main building open. So we did close the main building in mid-July, and it remains closed. One thing we have done, though, is we continue to open all of our outbuildings. And as Ken mentioned, one of the initiatives we've taken in recent years is to build many, many additional outbuilding signs or ground signs that interpret the history of each building and the stories that we tell at the museum. And the idea behind that is that the grounds are something that our community and visitors to the area can use 24 hours a day, essentially. And so we didn't want to miss that opportunity to be able to engage them with the history. And I've been really pleasantly surprised that almost every time I'm out there, there's somebody reading one of our signs, whether it's a dog walker, whether it's parents visiting or playing with their kids, they stop and read the signs. So we feel good about that we're able to engage folks through that. So that's kind of where we're at with COVID. Maybe I'll move on to something a little more positive. How about some of the special projects we're working on? So we have two pretty major projects we're working on outside of exhibits. The first of which is our Willamette locomotive. Are you guys all familiar with, have you been out and seen the locomotive? And read anything about it in the paper a little bit? So the Willamette locomotive is a pretty fascinating piece. It was built and delivered here to Western Montana in 1923, and was originally delivered to the Anaconda Company and would be used to transport timber and loggers back and forth between the logging camps in Western Montana and the Bonner Mill. It took on that role for, gosh, a couple decades. Eventually that company was sold to the Western Lumber Company, and it continued to do that. Eventually, by the time you got into the 1940s, the road system was much improved. So you had trucks that were able to transport lumber, and it was cheaper to do so than it was to do so by locomotive. So the engine kind of went into retirement in the 1940s, late 30s, early 40s. And it would stay there in kind of a barn at the Bonner Mill until 1954. In 1954, it was actually brought out of retirement so that it could star in the Hollywood feature Timberjack. So I'm sure all of you guys have probably caught Timberjack. The locomotive that was used in that film is our locomotive we have here at the Historical Museum in Fort Missoula. So it played its starring role in the film and was retired again, and eventually was placed at Bonner Park. And it sat in Bonner for years and years until the 1980s when they moved it here to the museum. So unfortunately, though, that means that locomotive is now spent most of its life sitting outside, exposed to sun and rain and snow and ice. So it's kind of gotten to the point where it needs some work. So we started looking, and like a lot of these big projects, and one of the funny things about museums is it's very specialized when you think about restoring a locomotive as opposed to restoring a piece of a textile or something like that. So we knew as a museum and as a staff that we needed to do something with the locomotive, but we didn't really have anybody on staff that had the knowledge base or any idea of what to do. So we kind of did what everyone does when you're not sure of. So we started to seek some estimates, and initially those estimates ranged anywhere from $30,000 just to put a coat of paint on it to we engaged the gentleman that restored Denny Washington's locomotive, and the price tag on that one was $300,000. So, you know, we've got this locomotive. We know we need to do something with it. We know we need to move forward. And we've got these huge gaps in what it's going to cost to restore or paint the locomotive. So we kind of had our own little guardian angel, I'm going to call him, a gentleman by the name of Larry Ingold, who was retired from the Sierra Pacific Railway in California. And Larry had retired and moved down the Bitterroot, and he was visiting our museum one day, and he kind of stopped in and he asked to see me and kind of asked, okay, what are your plans for the locomotive? And I, you know, kind of explained to what I just did to you folks, that we'd gotten these two estimates. We had no idea how to move forward with it. Well, it turns out Larry has worked on several locomotive restoration projects. And as he told me, my wife told me I need to get a project. So here we go. So Larry kind of engaged us, and my first step is kind of the director here was to get more information. And I'm also a historian, so naturally I'm going to do research. But so I asked Larry to put together a presentation that he could present to kind of our stakeholder groups here at the fort about his experience with locomotives and his past projects he's worked on, and maybe some of the research he would have in the process for restoring the locomotive. So he did that in the spring after we met him, and just blew us away with the knowledge that he brought to it, including, and this is a fun little story, and again, I'm going to ask, I feel like I keep asking you to raise your hands, but that's okay, because that's the only way I can interact with you and read you guys today. How many of people have seen the movie Back to the Future 3? No, a couple? Okay, well, Back to the Future was the Michael J. Fox with the DeLorean where he goes back in time. Well, they made 2 sequels to it, and the third sequel takes place in the Old West. And at one point, they're trying to get a locomotive that's going, what is it, 88.6 or 98 point, whatever the speed they have to go to time travel. So they're trying to get a locomotive up to that speed. Well, the locomotive that they use in the film was one of the ones that our guy Larry worked on. Not only did he work on the restoration of that locomotive, he has a cameo in the film. He is actually one of the trainmen shoveling coal into the engine in the film. So, it's kind of a neat little, not that qualifies him to restore a locomotive, but it's a pretty cool little story. So Larry came on and we started to formulate a plan. And one of the first things we all agreed on was that in order to protect the locomotive or to go to the trouble or the expense of restoring it, we really needed to protect it from the elements. So the first step in this process was to build a pole barn that would cover the locomotive and keep the snow off of it. And I'm very pleased to say that in lightning speed for our organization, we were able to raise the roughly $30,000 through our annual fund ask last fall to build that locomotive pole barn. And that 30,000, when I say that, we really worked to get that number to be reasonable. Initially, when we had one of our volunteers who had retired from construction came up with an initial budget to have somebody else do the work, we were looking at roughly close to $70,000. Because when I say pole barn, it's a pretty significant structure if you haven't seen it yet. By using all volunteer labor, we were able to reduce that cost from close to 70,000 down to 30,000. From there, we worked to seek donations from different individuals and businesses in town. Jackson Contractors stepped up incredibly for us and agreed to provide the lifts and the labor to put the trusses up and get the roof on, which was one area with all volunteers that we were a little concerned about because the train shed sits 28 feet in the air. So having volunteers 28 feet in the air putting a roof on was a little nerve-wracking, but they donated that for us. So we ended up being able to build that for well under the 30,000, which was great because any difference will go towards the actual restoration of the train. So we completed the pole barn this spring. And again, as a museum and a nonprofit in the community that has a lot of nonprofits, fundraising can be challenging at times, especially raising larger amounts of money. So for us to be able to raise the money and complete the project in 6 months is kind of lightning speed for us. But that now allows us to move forward with the actual restoration of the train. And to date, we've raised, I'd say a little over 20, maybe close to 25,000 towards the physical restoration of the train. The total budget on that will be about 91,000. And again, that's supplies, professional services that we can't do with volunteers, but everything else has been entirely done by volunteer, with Larry leading the charge and doing the research on it. So it's an incredibly exciting project. Our goal with it is to have it complete by 2023, which would be the 100th birthday of the train. So we're hopeful to do that. It'd be great to rededicate it at that date. So, but if you have a second and you want to come out to the museum, come out and take a walk. It's a great place to walk your dog. It's a great place just to kind of get away from the hustle and bustle, especially in COVID times. Come out and check out the new pole barn and take a look at the train. It really is a pretty fascinating piece of our history. So the other big project that we're working on currently at the museum is an assessment of 2 original alien detention center barracks that we've acquired in the last few years. As I mentioned, one of the things that we really put an emphasis on in the last probably 5 years is the story of the 2,200 men that were held at Fort Missoula during World War II. And one of the reasons we've done that is that, while we're always going to be a local history museum, we see this story and the community that's growing up around it with our Japanese American confinement sites groups as being the potential to really put our museum on the map on a national scope or an international scope. This story is something that's way bigger than just Missoula County. So it gives us that opportunity. The other thing is, while what are called the War Relocation Authority camps, WRA camps, which held 120,000 Japanese Americans, are pretty well known and acknowledged now. there were only a couple of these smaller camps that were run by the Department of Justice that held foreign nationals that were essentially caught in the United States when war broke out in both the Pacific, the Asian Pacific, and then also in Europe. In these cases, the men that were at Fort Missoula, the 1,000 Japanese men were living in the U.S. as foreign nationals because legal or as legal aliens, resident aliens, because they legally were not allowed to become U.S. citizens. So even if they wanted to petition for citizenship, they were prevented from doing that by a 1924 law, the Asian Exclusion Act, I believe it was, but that prevented folks from becoming American citizens. So many of them had been living in the U.S. for decades. At the time war broke out, the U.S. government kept a list of not people who they had evidence had done anything wrong, but people who they viewed as potentially disloyal. When Pearl Harbor happened, within 24 hours, they scooped up these Japanese men, many of which were religious leaders. They were businessmen, farmers, orchardists, things like that in their communities. But they scooped them up, didn't tell their families where they were going, and sent them to Fort Missoula. So those were the Japanese that were here. The Italians that were here were merchant seamen or World's Fair workers, basically anyone that was young and male and got stuck in the US when the war broke out in Europe. And of course, why would the United States want to let 1,200 able-bodied young men go back and fight against our allies in Europe? So they essentially impounded the ships of these men and then waited till their 90-day visas ran out and then arrested them for being in the country illegally and sent them here to Fort Missoula. The Japanese were here for a shorter period of time, usually only about 3 to 6 months, and they were put through a loyalty hearing process where they had to not prove that they didn't have to prove, so they had to prove their innocence, which is completely against our system of justice where, it's the job of the state to prove your guilt. In this case, they had to prove that they were loyal to the United States. The majority of them they called it paroled, which basically meant they were allowed to join their families at another camp, usually more of a traditional camp because many of their kids obviously were born here in the States. So they were Japanese Americans. So they were allowed to join their families in another camp after they were paroled. A couple were released, but even those folks were required to go someplace in the Midwest and away from the West Coast. The Italian men at our site actually spent 3 years here. From 1941 until Italy surrendered in 1944. So they spent a significant amount of time. There are a couple, and I will say the Italians were given a little more leeway than the Japanese were. The number of reasons for that, most obvious, they look like us, the Japanese men didn't, so they were more accepted into our community. Another major factor for the Italians was that they had the Catholic Church on their side. So the Pope actually even intervened and the local church intervened. And these men were allowed to go to mass. They were allowed to go to sing in choirs at the local church. So they also were allowed to go out and work in the community, do agriculture work, sugar beet farming, things like that. And were actually paid for their work as well too.